Hi, we're going to get started. Thank you. We'll have more time for networking later. It's great to see everyone chatting, but we want to get on time. We have a good audience. Okay, we'll see. So I'm getting some of these. People aren't hearing well enough, but we'll work that out. Great. So welcome to Obesity in Canada, Confronting the Epidemic and Its Impacts. My name is Andre Picard. I'm the health columnist at the Globe and Mail, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's event. Welcome to everyone here in Toronto, in this big room, and to the many people joining us virtually across the country. I want to begin, of course, by acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and that Toronto is today home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The purpose of a land acknowledgement is to prompt us to reflect on the impacts of colonialism and our role in reconciliation, both individually and collectively. And that's directly relevant to today's topic. We know that Indigenous people have been stripped of their land and their connection to the land and traditional foods. It's not a coincidence that people who have no food security have among the highest rates of obesity. That's one of the many issues we're going to touch on today. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 billion people worldwide are living with obesity, 1 in 8 people on the planet. The World Obesity Federation estimates the economic impact of obesity will top $4 trillion by 2035. In Canada alone, about 9 million adults are considered obese, and the economic costs are estimated at $27.6 billion a year. Obesity is a medical issue, and it's an economic issue. There's also a complex social and cultural interaction at play. Our relationship to food and to our bodies is complex and sometimes complicated. Access to care and compassion in care is hampered by a long-held view that obesity is a lifestyle choice rather than a chronic illness. Stigma is rampant. It's sometimes said that fat phobia is the last acceptable prejudice. These days, we can't talk about obesity without talking about drugs. GLP-1 agonists are sometimes called miracle drugs, but they're only one part of the puzzle of weight management and of healthy living. Again, we'll dig into these issues as well. Throughout today's events, we'll be discussing this and much more, with a particular emphasis on strategies that can be used for better outcomes for health of the population and for individuals. So let's get started. Thank you for the musical interlude. Normally, I usually tell people when their phone goes off during one of my events, I ask them to come up and dance to the tune. But I'll give you a pass, and the next person will get to dance for us. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Sandra Alia is the chair of Obesity Matters, a Canadian nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering individuals living with obesity through education, support, and advocacy. An innovator in food addiction recovery, Sandra developed and leads Canada's first outpatient food addiction recovery program, and it's been implemented in medical clinics nationwide. She's also author of the best-selling book, Never Enough: 3 Pillars of Food Addiction Recovery. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sandra Alia.
Oh, thank you. It is such an honor to be here today on World Obesity Day to share my story of living with obesity. And this year, we are focusing on the systems, not the people that need to change. So let me tell you about my story. It starts where all of your stories start, at conception. So this might take a while. I'm joking. When my mother was pregnant with me, she was living with obesity and bipolar disorder. So she not only passed on her genes, but she passed on her complex relationship with food that was shaped by trauma, scarcity, and compulsion. And today, science confirms and my life proves that obesity is up to 70% inheritable. That means before I took my first breath, before I had my first meal, obesity was in the cards for me. And at the tender age of 8, I became my mother's healthcare advocate and translator because she didn't speak English. And together, we set out to make her better. But that was 40 years ago, and the healthcare system used blame, shame, and scare tactics. The lack of treatment would mean that I would bear the weight of caring for my mother. They did not see it as a real medical condition. And sadly, we still face that today. Just last week, the Quebec health minister declared that obesity is not an illness. And that's where our health system is failing us. Now, when a mother is not well, it is very hard for a child to thrive. And part of my story includes childhood trauma and neglect, and that is often correlated with developing obesity. So it would make sense that children would find solace in food. Chemically engineered foods made to comfort, made to numb, made to excite us. But let's be clear, they are not made to nourish us. Ultra-processed foods, highly palatable foods, are affordable, accessible, and most dangerously, addictive. Sugary sweet cereal companies are targeting our children, and that is where the food systems are failing us. But I didn't start gaining weight until my preteen years, and then I spent my teen years desperate to be thin. I grew up in the 80s, and MTV had just hit the airwaves, and I loved watching music videos. And on those music videos, they depicted one kind of beauty, very tall, very slender, blonde, blue-eyed. And they were having the time of their lives, and I wanted that life. But I didn't look like them. I was a short, curvy, Calabrese young lady. So I decided to get on that roller coaster ride of restricted dieting. And I started whatever fad diet was popular at that time, and I'd lose some weight, and the rebound would be regaining it, and then some, and then I would double down my efforts and lose some weight and regain it, and I just dieted my way into obesity. So then, in my 20s, I went to my doctor and I asked for help, and she made it very clear. It's a simple formula, calories in versus calories out. And it seemed so simple, but I couldn't do it. And that oversimplistic view on a complex medical condition further stigmatizes people living with obesity. And my increasing weight year after year kept me away from the doctor for all health concerns because I couldn't answer the question, why wasn't I eating less and moving more? But then at 24, I landed my dream job. I got a job at an international consulting firm. It was my chance to work on Bay Street. I wanted to fit the part. So I hired an elite Bay Street dietitian. And she promised that I could lose 50 pounds in 6 weeks. I was like, sign me up. And what I didn't know at the time was over 95% of all diets fail. But I did manage to lose those 50 pounds. But this story does not have a happy ending. The rebound was brutal. I not only gained the 50 pounds I lost, but an additional 50. And it was humiliating, to say the least, to show up at work month after month, heavier and heavier. And the shame I felt was reflected back to me in the eyes of my coworkers. Because diets don't work. The diet was never going to work. But somehow, I always blamed myself. So I went to my employer this time and asked for help. I asked for a reduced work week. I just needed a little space and a little time to catch my breath and deal with this weight that I had gained? And the answer was no. This led me to go on disability leave, a much more costly option for my employer. You see, even today, many workplaces see obesity as a lifestyle choice and do not offer treatment. But then we have to ask ourselves, if the workplace is contributing to obesity through shift work, high stress, lack of autonomy, are they not responsible? Do they have an ethical responsibility to care for the people they employ? So during my sick leave, I spent a lot of time, an extraordinary amount of effort to lose that 100 pounds. But understand that was a very unique time in my life. I didn't have a child, I was single, and I invested all of my day with extreme support, and that is not available or possible for most people. It was a happy time in my life. I had 6 years of weight stability, and I had adventures and travel, and I lived abroad and dated, and it was so great. But it's important to note that obesity is a chronic, relapsing condition, and it often ebbs and flows with life's challenges. Stress can bring about setbacks, not because of a lack of willpower, but because that is the nature of a chronic illness. So I ride the waves of life going up and down, and often my weight follows. But today, we have effective treatment to help us with obesity. So the path to effective treatment is often paved with bias. And people living with obesity face bias in 3 very powerful places. We have internalized bias, societal bias, and healthcare bias. It shapes the way we see ourselves, the way others treat us, and the medical help that we get. It's about the voice in my head, the whispers around me, and the authoritative voice that I get at the doctor's office. So this is a picture of me at 25, and I have to tell you, I was scared to show this picture. It's very vulnerable, and I went back and forth. Should I, shouldn't I, shouldn't I? And I don't want, the smile should not fool you. It was a very sad, dark place in my life. And I didn't want to show it because part of me doesn't think I've changed. And the other part of me knows that there's no before and after pictures with obesity, because this is a chronic illness. This is only a journey that requires lifelong treatment. However, I will not seek treatment if I believe the voices in my head that tell me that I am not deserving, that I shouldn't ask for help, that this is my fault. And this is where media can help us rewrite that script in our heads. When media portrays various body sizes and appearances and shapes, it helps us widen this narrow belief of what acceptable and beautiful is. Help us challenge the stereotypes. When a news article comes out about obesity, no longer show people living with obesity eating fast foods, focusing on our abdomens and backsides without heads, because that dehumanizes us. Instead, show images of real people living full lives, deserving of respect and dignity. And social media platforms can put in policies that restrict content that further stigmatizes people. And we should be hiding diets and cosmetics procedures from underage users. At the end of the day, the price that I paid for obesity at that time was a life half-lived, declining health, strained relationships, and the constant battle of feeling like I was in a body that didn't represent me. So when we manage to quiet those voices in our heads, society has biased. And so often, the finger of blame is pointed at us. And when that happens, you're telling people not to seek help. And these are the whispers that we hear, or the silent thoughts and the glances. But this is where government can play a very pivotal role. When we have government-backed public awareness education programs to educate Canadians, employers, healthcare about the science of obesity and dismantle those myths that fuel bias, then we're going to start changing the societal voice. We need the government not only to say that obesity is a real chronic condition, but you got to walk the talk. If you believe it is, then you need to provide the public health care that covers anti-obesity medicines, therapy, and treatments. And lastly, I think we need to call for the government to include weight as a protected category under the human rights laws so that we will no longer be discriminated against at workplaces, schools, healthcare, or public places. And then, when it comes from the top down, these voices can begin to change. So now, if you have that courage to walk through the door of internalized bias and you've walked through the door of societal bias, now you open the door to see your doctor. And when I talk about healthcare bias, I want to be very clear that I am not talking about the expert panel we have here today. Because our panel today, they're unicorns. These are doctors and clinicians that treat obesity with compassion and dignity and love. And I believe, and I think we can all agree, that doctors are here to heal. And when things go wrong, like they did in these quotes, it's likely because they do not have the resources and tools. But today we're going to hear from Obesity Canada. They've done all the heavy lifting. They have the evidence-based resources that can transform to compassionate care. They have a great tool called the 5 A's of obesity management, and it starts with the first A, which is ask for permission to talk about the patient's weight. Simple yet profound step that shifts the conversation and puts the power and dignity in the hands of the patient. So now is the time to equip all healthcare providers with knowledge and resource so that we can provide compassionate care and rebuild trust. This is an important time where we do need to rebuild trust. So it's an exciting time in obesity. It's the first time in history, because I've been an advocate since I was 8 years old, that there are obesity clinical practice guidelines, an actual template for treating obesity. So when you go to your doctor, there are 3 pillars. There's the behavioral pillar, the pharmacotherapy pillar, and the bariatric surgery pillar. And if you're not engaging in one of those pillars, you're not being treated for obesity. And it's important to understand some patients will need 2 and some will need all 3, and all of that is okay because we are trying to heal the person. We are also at a place where we have safe, effective anti-obesity drugs that quiet the food noise. So much of my mental real estate was given up to food and to weight, and these pharmacotherapy drugs allow you to have the space and the energy to do all the things that we all need to do to be well. Part of ending the bias and stigma is understanding that everybody needs to eat whole, natural foods, regardless of your body size. That everybody needs movement in their life, regardless of your size. And some of these anti-obesity drugs give you that space, that leg up to be able to do the things that give you health and allow you to thrive. And we are starting to create safe communities, non-judgmental communities. And this is why Obesity Matters exists. We have brought together people from across Canada to educate, to advocate for, to empower, to make people finally feel like they matter. And we offer a free monthly workshop where we bring these amazing experts into the living rooms of people across Canada who normally would never have access to these experts. So if you want to learn more, you can click on that code. Real change happens when science meets compassion, accessibility, and community. So one of my greatest hopes whenever I speak is that I'm able to shift some perceptions. I hope that today you walk away knowing that no one chooses obesity. There are many, many contributing factors, and many of them are outside of a person's control. That obesity is not just about body weight or body image. It is a human vulnerability. Behind every statistic you're going to hear today, there's a real person living with the mental, physical, and emotional challenges that come with obesity. And the numbers are high. That means everybody in this room has a loved one, a family member, a friend, a colleague who has lived with obesity, and you may have witnessed them struggle with health and relationships and a sense of belonging. And so today, you can leave and look at them through the lens of compassion and empathy. So where are we headed? What's the promised land? Well, if we can get government, media, health, and food systems all aligned to uplift and support people living with obesity, well, then we're on the road to healing. My mom died of obesity at 69, and I'm going to blink and be in my 60s. And she did pass down her struggles, but the legacy ends with me. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and as most teenagers, she doesn't listen to anything I say, but she's watching me. And if I want her to love the body she has today and make her health and happiness a priority, I gotta show her through my actions. And that's how we change. It's not just our words, but it's our actions, because the next generation, they're watching. Our decisions, they're gonna be impacted by them. So if you're living with obesity, I wanna say we see you, we hear you, and we value you. So here we are. Each one of us has the power to rewrite a new story about obesity. So together we can rise and do it. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, again for really setting the stage for today's discussion, reminding us what really matters in our discussion today. We saw you, we heard you, and we value your words. Thank you. So next up, we have two guests who will discuss something that flows really well from Sandra's talk, the systemic barriers that contribute to obesity and the importance of compassionate and equitable care. So please welcome to the stage, I have here Dr. Sean Wharton. He's an internal medicine physician working in obesity medicine and research. He's also an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and he has many other titles, and I would take the whole half hour if I gave them all. So I'll ask him to join us. And joining us virtually is a registered dietitian, Terry Deyowantrant-Moreau, DO for short. I see you're in your car. So she's joining us here, and I'm going to sit down and ask them some questions and have a little chat. So Sean, I want to start with you, maybe a bit of a counterintuitive question because we're here discussing obesity, but I want to ask you, does weight matter?
Wow, that's a great, that wasn't in my list of questions, Andre. Were you throwing around these
I told you I was going to keep you on your toes.
really difficult questions? So the question of does weight matter? I think it's on who you're asking and what you think of as actual weight. If you're talking about does weight matter as in our body size, and it doesn't matter. What matters is, are you loved? Are you cared for? Do you recognize that? Do you feel it? Do you understand it? If we're talking about does weight matter, does visceral adiposity actually lead to inflammatory conditions that cause coronary artery disease, fatty liver, kidney failure, then yes, in those instances it actually matters. And so the weight connected to the visceral adiposity matters. But I really spend a lot of time trying to speak to people about the fact that body size is an individual component. It's something that people shouldn't be judging you on. And if an African American woman, a Hispanic woman, a woman with a BMI of 32, which is considered in the obesity class 1 stage, if she has no prediabetes, no pain in her knees, no family medical conditions that would lead us to think that this is a problem, she shouldn't be defined as having obesity. She should be defined as beautiful. And that's what we need to really try and understand.
It's not an either or.
No, exactly. And it's more on the beautiful side. And less on the, unless you really do have a medical condition. When you have a medical condition that's associated with it, type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, and we can work on those things. But we still need to recognize that the person's weight and body shape is not oftentimes primarily the problem. The visceral adiposity can be, and we can deal with that. And we can even deal with getting rid of their type 2 diabetes with medications and not addressing weight. So we have to not always think that weight matters the way that that leads to bias and discrimination.
Right. And we'll come back to some of those issues again. Dio, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Now, you're a dietitian, but we've discussed this panel beforehand, and you were telling me you don't focus exclusively on food. You focus on well-being. You're part of the community, etc. Tell me why you have this broader approach to dealing with obesity.
I'll just introduce myself here. So Scano, Deoicho, Niwak Sanadan, Otkakioni, Niwaka Shaudan, Gaikono, Niwak Wentenden, Agablaini. I just wanted to say hi to all my Haudenosaunee people that understand Gaikono language. And I'm sitting in my vehicle right now because my mother gets great reception by her maple trees, and we just had maple syrup ceremony here on Six Nations, and we are tapping trees right now. So my family just outside, and I was just outside with them doing exactly that. So touching the earth, remembering what's important at this time, and yeah, it's really important for me as a Haudenosaunee person to be carrying on that responsibility. I look at it as a personal responsibility, but also as a professional responsibility. I know that practicing for the time that I did in dietetics, it was very Western centered. It was centered around, the micros of food, right down to the minute, and how it affected the body, which was an amazing opportunity to learn and to think about food in that way. But I knew from my teachings and Haudenosaunee cultural values that it also feeds my heart and my mind and my body in a different way by just being out here on the land. Those things are all a part of that wellness piece, a holistic type of wellness that I don't always see offered when we have to sit in our offices as clinicians, which I did that as well for a number of years. But I really do see more value in, for myself and my family, being out on the land and being connected to nature and being able to talk about food in a different way, in a relational sense, as opposed to just something to nourish or satiate my need or gratification, etc.
You deal not just with individual patients, but you promote food sovereignty, for example. Can you talk a bit about the importance of that to people's health?
Absolutely. So again, I think there's a lot of space that has been interrupted for Haudenosaunee people, Ongwe people, so the original peoples of this land. And I think being able to enact sovereignty through culture and language has been something that has brought such a resilience to myself and my family. And again, that's what I'm able to share with patients and in practice, and share with colleagues as well. I always wanted to be out on the land, but again, when you don't have the balance, when you're working very clinically, it makes it hard to be able to be that sovereign person. And that's what I see sovereignty as, my ability to balance my practice out with being on the land. And it's intentional, I don't need to get maple syrup out of the tree. It's on the grocery store shelf. I can get it there if I want it and need it as well. But there's a relationship, there's a reciprocity, there's responsibility, having my children and my family with me to learn and to carry on this knowledge of knowing very simple things: where to put the spout on the tree, where's the sun coming and hitting the tree to make it run longer after the freeze or the frost, right? Those are all really important aspects, and there's small details that come with the relationship and the reciprocity of how we rely on our living environment around us. And to me, that's sovereignty, because it's my space that I'm choosing to be involved in and connected to, and recognizing and valuing how it builds self. And that to me is a sovereign space.
Thanks. Sean, you've been at this for a while, a clinician, a researcher. What have you learned about the drivers of obesity? What are the underlying factors? I saw you laughing when Sandra said, oh, it's calories in, calories out. It's simple. I guess it's not that simple.
Yeah, it isn't that simple. And the answer to what the drivers of obesity are is definitely not a simple answer. So we try to reduce it to very easy things that we can easily understand, which is sometimes helpful messages to have this reductionism, but it's not accurate. And so there are a couple things that we do know. There's a lot more that we don't know, but we do know a couple things. One of the main things is that genes, it's a genetic condition, the same way the size of our nose, our hair color, etc. It's absolutely genetic that obesity can come from genes. We look like our parents. If you have two parents who have polygenic obesity, the chance that that child will have polygenic obesity is almost 100%, like 100%. And so we're very clear about that. We're also clear about the next component, which is progress. Every single component of progress, from learning how to farm to the turn of the century, to the printing press, to now cell phones, to any technological advance, any advance, period, in science and antibiotics, you name it, it's led to obesity.
Because it's made life easier.
Because it's made life easier.
Okay.
Yep, life easier, life longer, we're not doing things to make life harder. And so those are two things that we know. Everything else is a bit challenging. Is it due to poverty? Is it due to mental health conditions? If everybody was happy, would we still have obesity? If everybody was rich, would we still have obesity? If there wasn't trauma, we know that they're associated with those things. So there's clear associations, socio-economic associations. If you're poor, if you've had trauma, if there's a mental health condition, obesity follows it. It's connected to it, but is everything else connected to it too? And so we can't answer all of the questions as to where obesity came from, why now, why so prevalent in the past 50 years. Everyone thinks they know the answer. If you have someone on stage who thinks they know the answer, they're the wrong person to have on stage, because they clearly don't. And so I think that's where we need to go. We need to be compassionate about it, compassionate that the science isn't here yet for us to understand all of the parameters, and that we're working on it. So people living with obesity in the world needs to be compassionate towards the scientific field or the field of moving forward. We're trying to understand all these things. We know a little bit more about some of the answers to help with obesity at times, but we don't always know about what causes it.
And there's an important component that varies by race. The South Asian community, Indigenous communities, they have much higher rates. Is that all genetic, or is it part of that environmental, social determinants?
Yeah, so there's probably a couple components to it. Within families, there's a genetic component, so it's very clear. But within a group of people, there's millions of families and millions of variations and millions of differences. So we don't have one group that is just going to have a propensity to living with obesity. The Indigenous, the South Asians, Black, white, because biologically they're all the same and there's a variability across all of them. But if you're in one group, one village that has a whole connection to it, then absolutely. So the primary drivers, as they are the drivers for hypertension and multiple other things in the world, is the social environment, the socioeconomic challenges. So the Indigenous population has a higher rate of obesity and death from obesity and death from type 2 diabetes because they're discriminated against. That's the clarity. Black African Americans have a higher rate of comorbidity from high blood pressure, not because of biological forces, because they're discriminated against. So we need to know that both of these things live in concert. If your whole family has high blood pressure, your whole family has type 2 diabetes, your whole family has obesity, the chances of whether you're rich or you're poor, you're likely going to end up getting it. But if you have a propensity to it and you're living in a socioeconomic environment that is challenging and will bring it out, then yes, your chances are much higher of actually getting it.
So it's complicated.
So it's complicated. It's complicated. Exactly.
Now, Dio, you work with First Nations people a lot, Haudenosaunee. Do you have to do, as Sean, talk about these larger issues, about the trauma, about the social realities, the social environment? Does that come into your treatment of patients with obesity as a dietitian? Try and get the technical issue worked out and see if we can get you back. Get to look at Sean and I in the meantime. Okay, give me a wave when she's back, and we'll talk to Sean a little more. So we've already heard a couple of times about drugs, GLP-1 agonists. They're getting a lot of attention these days. Where do they fit into this? The treatment armamentarium, if you will. For you, how do you use them?
Right. So I come from a background, I'm a pharmacist. I did my doctorate in pharmacy. I'm interested in pharmacokinetics. That's the way the drugs move around the body, how they get absorbed into the body. I'm interested in the dynamics, how they connect to the receptor, and they actually then end up working. So that biology and that science is what drove me to go into medical school and to do a lot of the scientific research. So I love pharmacotherapy and pharmacology. As much as I love it, I don't believe that it is the solo answer to all of the problems that we actually have. I came to this field trying to think about discrimination. I was in the field of medicine because I was interested in the fact that African Americans are black people. Black people have higher levels of high blood pressure and complications from it. And I was like, why? What's going on? What's up with that? And is it a biology problem? Is it a medication problem? Do some medications work, not work? Found out that it's primarily racism. It's primarily due to bias, discrimination, and racism, not due to biological factors. But we know that medications can actually make a big difference. So you can die less as a result of the medication, even if you can't fix this problem. Work on fixing the problem as to why there's discrimination and why there's bias, stigma, and problems and trauma that causes the obesity, that causes the elevated weight. In the interim, we do have medications that actually make an actual difference. And for the people that have worked on so many different aspects of their life and are still struggling, we know that this is an intervention that will make a significant difference. But it's not the only intervention. We need to continue working on this part of the love and compassion and societal changes.
Great. And I see Dio's back, so we're going to try. I thought she was fixing me with a stare before, but she was just frozen on the screen. So I was asking before, I don't know if you heard the question, but I'll repeat it. I was asking, you deal with a lot of patients in First Nations, Haudenosaunee in particular. Do you raise these issues, beyond what people are eating? Do you have to talk about the trauma, about the discrimination in society, about intergenerational issues? Does that all come up in the treatment of weight management?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's really meeting the patients where they're at. Like, I really want to understand why they're there with me and what they're looking to gain from our time together, which again is why it's so important for me to continue to build self and build my responsibility and my knowledge. Like, the way that I talk about food with my patients and my clients is in that relational factor. So I have to be able to express how it connects with me so that I can allow them to share in that same relation building aspects, right? Because if they come to me and they want to learn more cultural knowledge over and above what foods are high in fat or trans fats, etc., then that's what I'm going to base our discussions on. And typically that is where a lot of patients regain autonomy, just representation of cultural identity in those discussions. And that goes far beyond whatever numbers on the scale or how many amounts of something they're supposed to or not eat at certain times. It's really important for them, again, to build that food relationship up again through different colonial practices, residential schools, etc., being removed from the land, being forced to eat foods that are not culturally identifying or loving or relationship building as children, carrying that over multiple generations has really made an impact in how people see our traditional food system. And many of the foods that are in the grocery food store today, I mean, they're either imported or brought from other places. They don't have the highest or fullest nutritional quality. So there's no assumption that just because you can go to the grocery store and get more fruits and vegetables that they're much more healthier for you, right? When like we pick different greens from just around our home, we pick different berries from around our home and from the trees and the shrubs around us. It's movement, it's connecting, it's being out on the land, it's learning again at what times and what seasons are these foods available and when can you pick them when they're most the highest in nutritional quality, right? And then again, it's that sustainable aspect of being able to carry that forward so that you know your children are going to be able to still be able to access this. Like, I don't know that the grocery stores are always going to be where they are for how long, if it's going to be the same store, the same quality, right? But I can learn that in building a relationship around my home and the environment that sustains me. So
Saying living off the land exclusively, it's a mix of the two, realistically.
absolutely, yeah.
Sean, I want to talk about another thing that Sandra brought up. She said it was about self-worth. How does that play into it? People often don't feel good about themselves if they feel they're overweight. How does that play into your clinical practice?
Yeah, so it's the element of bias, that there's internalized bias, there's external bias. So what is bias? People have a difficulty understanding it, and I have difficulty understanding it. When we started to write the guidelines with Arya Sharma, who's my mentor and is going to be coming up and speaking, one of the first things that we talked about is that we have to address the idea of bias. And I thought I knew what it was, and I didn't. And, I really had to be taught about it, but I lived it my entire life. So bias is prejudice. So and everybody here is biased against people living with obesity. It's just a natural thing. If you grew up on this planet, you have a bias against people living with obesity because you've seen The Little Mermaid, and The Little Mermaid is this big, and Ursula is this big, right? And that's just one image. I've got hundreds and hundreds of images that you're going to see and listen to as you're driving home. We're inundated with it as a result of that inundation of the negative aspects of people living with obesity. We're biased against them, and as a result, we have stereotypes or stigma. So stereotype is a stigma as well, and so we stigmatize them in negative pictures, etc. Look at the internet. And then we have the discrimination, which is also racism. And so, all of those things end up combining to, what's the question again, Andre? Can you believe I actually really forgot?
Self-worth.
Oh my God. Thank you. How did I get down this train? I love that train. I love the train of talking about my discrimination. So that idea of self-worth comes from the own internalized bias that has been fed to a person. So we're here to try to change all of that, to change the person's idea of, are they worth it? Are they loved? Are they cared for at their highest weight? They need to know that at their highest weight, they are the most loved. Not at their lowest weight. They shouldn't wait for love when they are 20 kilos lighter, 40 pounds lighter. The love should be at that highest level. And they have to expect it, and they have to walk tall with it and generate it. How do we do that? Sometimes your healthcare provider is the person who does it for you. Sometimes it's not your husband, it's not your family members, it's not your wife, it's not your friends around you, it's the healthcare provider. So as a healthcare provider, I tell people that they're loved and that they're cared for, and that they're worth all of my time. They're worth the time of the science and of the that we try to do, and we're trying to answer all of these questions. They are worth it. Even if someone else hasn't told them that on that particular day, somebody who has some credibility is actively telling them that this is true. I hope I have to tell them it multiple times, possibly, for them to believe it, the same way other ethnic groups need oftentimes extra messages to understand self-worth. Black is beautiful movement in the 60s and 70s wasn't to the outside world, it was to us, to remind us that we are beautiful. And so I think that these type of messages need to be loud and clear for people living with obesity, for them to move to that next step. Because I'm not always good at getting their weight down, but I am good at letting them know that they're loved and cared for.
But does it have to start with loving themselves?
Sometimes, but not always. Sometimes it starts with who loves you. And whether your grandchildren love you. Your grandchildren love you when you're this big or when you're this big. They don't care. They love you, period. They want you to be there. So it doesn't always start like that. People always think that, don't you love yourself? It's like many people say, no, I don't. But I know who does love you. So we don't have to start with you loving yourself. You may put yourself third, fourth, fifth. I know who does love you. Eventually, I hope you do put yourself first, because you have to take care of those people. So if you love them that much, you have to be around to take care of them. So it's not always a set formula, but it is about making sure that those words, love and compassion, are true, and you can feel them in multiple levels.
And if people have questions, raise your hand. We'll try and get a mic to you. We'll have some time. But Dio, I want to come back to you while we're getting a mic to people. You talk a lot about what Sean is talking about the compassion, about caring for yourself. But it's hard. A lot of people don't have trust in the medical system. Not everyone looks like them. You're rare. You're a healthcare provider in their community. How do you get over that barrier of not trusting the system?
It's a hard one. I think there's a number of different ways. There are assessment and measures that I think that the system needs to project, that they need to share and remind others that they are trustworthy. I think it's very important that they're able to be authentic, especially in the space of providing, like if you're treating indigeneity or Indigenous people, that you're really able to share safe space, safe cultural space. And that's not always on the provider, it's actually within the organization. So it's systemic as well. So you need to make sure that your working environment shares the same values to be trustful and trustworthy and culturally supportive. Those are really big terms, because for a very long time it was not, well, even recently, it was not okay to identify yourself as an Indigenous person and to potentially request some sort of Indigenous cultural care, which is what I'm talking about. Like it includes being on the land, it includes being in your community and with your people and learning your language and connecting to your living environment in that way. That's cultural care, and that's not something that's readily available in most places where we do go to access clinical services. So there's that balance in collaboration of care and how you bring others into there. So if the system itself and the organization is having an issue of carrying trustful space and safe space, then they need to do internal reflection and internal measurements to gauge how they're going to move out of that space. And then they also need to collaborate in how they fill that space with trust and cultural safety along that journey forward of moving from that different colonial cultural type practice into something more collaborative with Indigenous people. So knowing the nations around them that can come to provide cultural and traditional language, healing ceremonies and support in that way, I think is really important, but it would never be on one provider to do so. I work often with people that have traditional knowledge in the community, traditional healing practices, and have access to traditional medicines. It's never my job to know everything and do everything. And I think that's a really important aspect of a healthcare provider, like to know that I trust myself to trust others and to build relationships in that way, that I can provide collaborative care to my patient, can help to show them that, I'm being responsible with their health and this process, and being respectful as well.
Great. We'll try and squeeze in a couple of audience questions. You guys on the far ends are really going to have to make yourselves be seen. It's a little difficult room, but we'll start right here in the middle. Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Michael Battel from Fatty Liver Alliance. Thank you for a very insightful discussion, important discussion. I wanted to follow up with a question from something we learned yesterday. Novo Nordisk had an Escape the Stigma escape room, and we learned a lot. And one of the things that I took away from it is that there's a lot of stigma from well-intentioned, unsolicited support. And it's hurtful, or it can be very hurtful for people. So how do you let people know that you care enough about them to want them to change? And as you said, sometimes it's medically important for them to change and sometimes not. But if you have family members that you know are suffering with obesity, how can you do it in a way that's not going to be offensive?
That's excellent. First of all, you have to back up and you have to say exactly what you said. You don't necessarily want them to change. You want them to know that they're loved. When they know that they're loved, they may change, maybe. But it's their choice, their autonomy. They're bright, capable people. We have this paternalistic view in healthcare where the person's sitting across from me because they're here to hear my information and me to tell them how to change. That's not true. They're a bright, capable person. They're there for you to be part of the connection of trying to understand the entire thing. Maybe you'll change, maybe you won't change, maybe you need to understand and you're looking for some understanding, but not necessarily looking for them to act like a parent, which is what we frequently do. We frequently think that. At times, so I don't think that, and Arya taught me this. Arya had you had somebody in Ottawa, in Parliament, who had a child living with obesity. And the question was, they came up to me and they said, how do I get this kid to run more and to act? I'm telling them all this stuff. He goes, no, stop all that. Tell them that you love them. Tell them that you care about them and you love them right now. Do you think that kid knows that they need to move and run and do things and eat in a different way, or listen to the advice on how to eat differently and eating in front of other people, which is a thing that as a result of bias and stigma. You need to eat lunch with the other kids, even though you may be getting teased. It's challenging, but they need to know they're loved while they're doing that so they can move forward. Otherwise, all our paternalistic views are wasteful and hurtful. And many doctors in Canada, the guidelines were written because doctors in Canada hurt other patients. They hurt patients by being paternalistic and telling them what to do. And that's why we wrote the guidelines. People were upset. Are you telling me that I'm a bad doctor? Yes. When it comes to doing that type of care for your patient, you're a bad doctor. You can be a better doctor by caring and having compassion and knowing that there's a smart person that's across the table from you.
So the doctors need to say that they love their patients.
No, they don't love their patients. Their patients deserve love and need to recognize that they are loved. Recognize that they are loved. It's not the doctor loving the patient. It's that they need to be hugged by community, by society, hugged by being heard at times, or if they're actually asking for help, to be actually helped. The doctor needs to know when they need to do all of those things. It's important.
I'll share
Great,
too. I
thank you
think
both
that
for that important message. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking Dr. Sean Wharton, Dio Morrow in her lovely car. Thanks for joining us. And we're now going to take a 15-minute networking break. There's coffee and I think snacks down there, and please join us back here at 2:25. Thank you. We're going to get started. If people could come in from the coffee. Thank you. I'm glad to hear a lot of networking going on, a lot of good, I'm meeting a lot of interesting people. I'm sure you all are, so great. That's a big part of why we're here. So our next discussion is going to be focused on the ripple effects of obesity and how treating it can help prevent other illnesses. Joining me on stage are Dr. Ravi Retkanaran. He's a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto, an endocrinologist, and a clinician scientist at Mount Sinai Hospital, just up the street. And joining him is Dr. Sanjeev Sakalingam. He's the scientific director of Obesity Canada. He also wears many other hats, including Chief Medical Officer of CAMH, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, and he's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Thank you both for being there, and I'm going to
Oh, okay. Oh.
I think I'm out of battery. I think I need a battery change here. Sorry.
I got a microphone coming.
Okay, well, Okay, sorry about that technical glitch, folks. So, Sanjeev, if I could start with you after getting unplugged here. I want to start with a question that's been asked for many, many years. It's the classic, is obesity a chronic illness or is it just a risk factor for other illnesses? And I'll note, just this morning, the Alberta government came down and said, well, it's a chronic illness. They've actually made an official statement, so that's a good thing. But I'm going to let you answer the question, even though I've given a hint about what you're going to answer.
We try not to bias me in any way, Andre, but I think this is a long-standing question. And you mentioned the news about the Alberta government. We also have on the other side of the country in Quebec, where we have the opposite opinion about obesity as a chronic disease. And so, I think we should start with the fact that both the American Medical Association and the Canadian Medical Association recognized obesity as a chronic disease based on the science and evidence of obesity and its impact. And when we say chronic disease, I think we know that there are definitely biological factors that influence the development of many of the health comorbidities, complications, and impact on quality of life for individuals. And so understanding that, I'm a psychiatrist, and there's probably a reason why I'm on the panel too in many hats, but we know that there's a brain-body connection for obesity, and it's important for us to recognize that. We know that, like many chronic diseases, obesity is not a one-shot treatment, right? There's no quick fix in this or magic bullet, and that this is a condition that requires ongoing integrated treatment to achieve the outcomes, and when people will have changes in their health as a result of living with obesity, much like diabetes, mental health conditions, other chronic diseases like cardiovascular diseases, for example, as well. So I think when we think about that, there are these multiple factors, and it is a health condition. It's been recognized, and we have treatments available now, multimodal treatments that also mimic chronic diseases.
And when a government like Alberta says it's a chronic illness or Quebec says it isn't, why does that matter?
Well, it matters because it recognizes the years of stigma that we've talked about and bias, right? Like when you say it's not a chronic disease, essentially what you're saying, this is, what we've been hearing for decades. This is part of willpower. It's a failure. Eat less, move more. All those statements that we've heard for decades and decades are perpetuated. And as a result of that, individuals who are living with obesity don't have access to real treatments, medical treatments that are out there, that we have research for, that we continue to build research for. And as a result of that, people don't get access to those treatments. They deal with internalized stigma, a lot of shame, and a lot of disability and a loss of very productive years in their lives. And the impact, as we know, for families is quite catastrophic as well.
Now, Ravi, there's a lot of health conditions that are associated with obesity. Diabetes, heart disease, cancer, fatty liver disease, chronic pain, sleep apnea. It's a very, very long list. But these conditions also exist in people who don't have obesity. So how do you sort it out, the cause and effect stuff?
Well, it depends on the condition, first of all. How you might sort out that relationship between obesity and the many of the conditions that you've described. I'll give the example of diabetes because it's close to my heart in terms of what I do. I think most people would be aware that, at the same time as we are having huge increases in prevalence of overweight and obesity in the past several decades, we've had a global increase in cases of diabetes.
And we're talking type 2, of course.
Type 2 diabetes, of course, yes. And these twin pandemics, if you will, or epidemics, if you will, have been referred to as diabesity. So what's the relationship there? Well, sometimes people think that the overweight or obesity is causing diabetes, and that's not actually true. You need to think of it in terms of, in the case of diabetes, that diabetes ultimately is determined by how well your body can secrete insulin to meet its needs. So insulin is secreted by the pancreas, and specifically by a set of cells in the pancreas called the beta cells. And we all are dependent on our beta cells to secrete just enough insulin for our needs to control our blood sugar. Where obesity comes in is that as we gain weight, we become more resistant to the secretion, to insulin, to the action of insulin, and in doing so, put a test to our beta cells. So this means that if you are at risk of diabetes and you develop or you pose a sufficient test for your beta cells by virtue of the weight that you gain, then you may progress from your beta cells being able to secrete enough insulin for your needs to not being able to do so. And not being able to do so would initially be a transition from normal glucose levels to prediabetes, and as not being able to do so continues, you'd progress from prediabetes to diabetes. And ultimately, to bring it back to the biology, that ability of the beta cells to secrete enough insulin is determined by your genes. So type 2 diabetes is largely a genetically determined disease, and ultimately, the way that overweight or obesity is factoring in is by determining whether or not that risk of diabetes that you inherited genetically is going to manifest or not. Now, that's just the case of diabetes. There are also several other diseases that you mentioned where the relationships can be like this, where the obesity is providing the set of conditions wherein risk for other diseases may manifest. And how that works is going to vary by condition.
But when you lose a lot of weight, you can often cure, in quotes, your diabetes, right? It goes away. These famous GLP-1 agonists were initially diabetes drugs.
Absolutely, they are diabetes drugs, but you won't hear the word cure from me.
And the reason, put it in quotes for you.
Put it in quotes, exactly. And so, one of the areas where I do research is in remission of type 2 diabetes. And we are very careful to emphasize that by the individual's development of diabetes is evidence of their having some defect in their beta cell function, or in their beta cell's ability to secrete enough insulin. And so while losing weight through whatever means, whether it's through lifestyle modification or a GLP-1 agonist or other pharmacotherapy or surgical means, while that might improve the capacity of the beta cells to work normally, that doesn't mean that the underlying condition is fixed. And so really the way to look at it, I like to tell people that think of remission of diabetes as really, 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 really well-controlled diabetes. But if you look at it that way, then you won't fall into the trap of thinking that all is fixed and all of the risks that I was worried about when I was diagnosed with diabetes are gone because it doesn't appear that they are.
Now, Sanjeev, we've talked today a lot about the physical effects of diabetes. You're a psychiatrist. Can you talk a little bit about the mental health impacts? We know there's an association with depression, for example. We know that a lot of treatments for depression cause significant weight gain. Can you talk about those connections?
Yeah, I think it's quite clear now. We have lots of research that shows a bidirectional effect of many mental health conditions and obesity. So, depression is 1.5 to 2-fold increase of developing obesity and vice versa in terms of the risk. We know that people who live with severe mental illness, like psychotic illnesses or bipolar disorder, inherently, before we even introduce medications, have a increased risk of developing obesity. And I'm guilty as a psychiatrist as I treat people who have depression or more severe mental illness. Many of the medications that I prescribe, unfortunately, have a high propensity for developing or increasing the risk of weight gain and developing overweight or obesity. I would say that there are other factors that are at play here, and if you take a biopsychosocial approach, we could capture some of what's been discussed thus far. So one, we know that there's increased inflammation, inflammatory states, both in the brain, but in our body, that also are correlated with both kind of mood disorders and obesity. We know that there are neurohormonal effects like cortisol levels, even insulin resistance as well. And there have been attempts to look at insulin treatments in the central nervous system to actually try to treat depression as a mechanism as well. And so we see that interface. We also know psychologically, I think Sean talked about it earlier today, that adverse childhood experiences, or what we call ACEs, there are lots of longitudinal studies from large databases and cohort studies that show they increase the risk of someone developing health conditions like obesity, but also mental health conditions as well, depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And then lastly, we can't forget the structural components to this. And so, people who both have mental illness and are living with obesity often don't have access or can afford highly nutritious foods and are really in these food deserts, or may not even have housing that allows them to get that predictability to get into routines for obesity management or prevention as well.
And that issue, trauma, keeps coming up again and again in all the presentations. That's an issue?
Yes, absolutely. And again, you can think about, Sandra talked about weight stigma and bias. That in itself is a trauma in itself. We know it's associated with increased cortisol and stress reactions over time. And as you have that in a more chronic level, that for sure can increase it. But we also know there's bullying that happens in childhood for people who are living in larger bodies, for example, and many other traumatic experiences that unfortunately people living with obesity have to endure. And as a result of that, there's no surprise that might perpetuate and kind of snowball in terms of risks, but also the mental health risks as well.
And Ravi, I want to come back to this issue of drugs. People are losing weight in ways that was unthinkable before. What's the impact going to be on these other conditions, like you study diabetes and others? Can you imagine what the impact's going to be? Is diabetes going to disappear if we do this right?
Yeah, so I mean, it's actually very exciting that now, as most of the audience will know, we have the capacity for achieving degrees of weight loss that, frankly, were going to be very difficult to achieve in the past. And that is encompassing not just the medications, but also greater understanding of lifestyle interventions, as well as surgical options. All of these can reduce are going to markedly reduce the prevalence of overweight and obesity. What's interesting now, and I'll use the case of diabetes here, but we can extend this to other conditions, is the idea that you have, and particularly in the case of the pharmacologic options, you have people using these medications to lower weight at an earlier point in the natural history than perhaps may have been done before. And so if we take what I talked earlier about the transition from having normal glucose levels to pre-diabetes to diabetes, obviously that's in someone who is at risk of diabetes by virtue of their genetically determined beta cell function. But now, if they were to be taking, say, a GLP-1 agonist at a point in time when they have pre-diabetes, we already have evidence for the fact that, yes, you are going to reduce their risk of progressing to diabetes by virtue of the fact that you're treating them with a GLP-1 agonist. But we can take that even earlier. We can think of individuals with normal glucose levels. Diabetes isn't on the radar for them. Everything is normal. They went to the doctor. Everything looks good. But say they are taking a GLP-1 agonist to lose weight. Well, you can imagine you are now going to have the scenario whereby you are now lessening the challenge that's going to be posed to their beta cells that, had it been left unchecked, was ultimately going to lead to them developing prediabetes and or diabetes. So you're going to get, in the current setting where excess weight is being treated far more effectively than it ever could have been before, you're going to get the scenario where people are going to attenuate the ability of that excess weight to have led to disease risk manifestation. And I'll use the example of the diabetes again. Let's say you've inherited, your genetically determined risk of diabetes by virtue of what it means for your beta cells was one that your beta cells are going to going to deteriorate over time, and ultimately you were going to develop diabetes. But let's say that now you treated excess weight at an early point in that natural history, let's say when you're 30, you have now changed the anticipated slope of deterioration of your beta cell function such that it may well be that you're never going to reach diabetes because the challenge being posed isn't going to happen. And we can extend this thinking to other conditions as well. Diabetes, we have a pathophysiologic basis for why this should be so. And I personally believe that yes, with the way that overweight and obesity are being treated now, and the recognition of obesity as a chronic illness, one of the downstream positive sequelae of all of this will be a reduction in the incidence of diabetes.
So you're talking about shifting the curves of these illnesses.
Yes.
But do you worry about medicalizing people who otherwise feel fine?
I actually don't. And the reason is because I would look at it as we can't have it both ways. We can't be saying that this is a chronic condition, yet we don't want to treat it by lest we medicalize it. Well, I would argue the reason you want to treat it is to avoid the types of adverse medical sequelae for which you would not have a discussion as to whether or not this is a chronic condition or a medical diagnosis. So, perhaps I see it too simply, but I'm not so worried about that.
So you're a proponent of early intervention.
I am,
put it that
very
way.
much
Okay.
so, yes.
Now, Sanjeev, Obesity Canada, you're associated with them, had a report recently, The Cost of Inaction. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about, there was a pretty dramatic figure, $27.6 billion in economic costs, but can you talk about the other costs of inaction, of just not addressing this problem?
Yeah, and I think when you throw that number around 27 billion within Canada, people often go to healthcare costs and talk about prevention, which we've talked about is a key component. But that only accounted to, in our analysis, just over $5 billion in terms of costs. The remainder of the cost is the impact on employment and functioning for individuals. So thinking about presenteeism, thinking about impact on kind of work productivity, work loss, days off work, and all the other associated costs in terms of quality of life and impact as well. That's the bulk of the cost to our society. And so if we're thinking about how we want to ensure we have a productive and thriving society, both personally but also as on a societal level in terms of economically, we really have to get serious about obesity treatment and obesity prevention as well as in part of the broader scheme of things. And I would say, in thinking about this, there was a recent report in Ontario by the Ontario Hospital Association on the burden of chronic diseases by 2040. And on there was diabetes, so you'll be happy, Ravi, that diabetes was on there. Osteoarthritis was on there. But where was obesity listed in that report? And again, this is our provincial report predicting 2040 burden. It was listed as a risk factor, not a chronic disease in that report. And so to me, if we are thinking about costs and the economical kind of impact, we need to bring that into our health planning and health systems approach to really elevate obesity. And I hate to say elevate because it should be equitable in terms of the approach and consideration to other chronic diseases. Yeah.
I want to come back to this issue of treating people who are not sick, if I could put it that way. Do you worry that will contribute to stigma, that it'll bring us backwards?
I don't, because I look at it as, we used to talk about the concept of metabolically healthy obesity. The idea of, a person who meets, diagnostic criteria for obesity by virtue of their BMI, but they don't have any of the types of medical sequelae that we might anticipate, abnormalities in their blood sugar or their blood pressure or their lipids, the fats in their blood. And so we would say they were metabolically healthy. But over time, it became apparent that really this was likely a transient state, that you were catching people at a point in time that was ultimately going to lead to the types of adverse sequelae where we would no longer be referring to this as metabolically healthy. And so, extending that concept, this recognition that, obesity is a chronic condition, it has real medical consequences. I'm not, I'm not supportive of the idea of accepting the idea that you haven't yet developed consequences and therefore all is good, because I think the evidence, certainly with regards to mortality, would suggest that no, metabolically healthy obesity is likely not quite as healthy as we might like to believe if we wait long enough, if we look at the long term. I did want to add one other thing to what Sanjeev was talking about, and I'm not an economist and I haven't thought about the kind of costs the way that Sanjeev would have. But one thing that comes to my mind is opportunity cost, because we're talking about prevention of a disease, of several diseases. And there's the costs that you can, the types of costs that Sanjeev was talking about, but there's also, if we intervene early enough and prevent the development of disease, then or conversely, the failure to do so in an era when you can do so is, in my mind, associated with an opportunity cost.
And Sanjeev, where do you sit on this? How early is too early to treat?
Well, I think there's the term prevention is a loaded term in healthcare, because I think there's a continuum which we often articulate, right? And we can talk about how do we prevent the development of obesity through a lot of the societal, public health, structural components that we've talked about thus far today. But I think we can start to map how we get further upstream. Like the first would be when people who are living with obesity right now have access to treatment immediately so they can get treatment to prevent further disability and co-occurring illnesses and conditions. We can think about people, as Ravi talked about, who might be pre-diabetic or getting further upstream to prevent sequelae and complications. And that's through all pillars of treatment, right? Behavioral, psychological, pharmacological, and surgical. And I think as we move further up, we also have to recognize thinking about both children and youth and how we childhood obesity and the pediatric impact is such a huge issue. We need to think about interventions there that are effective and safe, and need the research and science to support those interventions as well. So I think we think along the age continuum, but also the disease continuum, to think about where we might be able to intervene earlier on. And I would say there are many points we can get upstream from where we are today in 2025.
And again, I want to invite people, if you have questions, raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. During the break, people were complaining to me, we want more time to get our questions in, so we're going to give you that. I want to continue, Sanjeev, with this. How do you balance, though, what we heard from Sean, we love you the way you are, and we want you to start taking this drug even though you feel fine? How do you find that right balance?
Yeah, so I'll build on what Sean talked about. I think there is a paternalistic or hierarchical nature of healthcare. And I'll be the first to admit, physicians are often the culprit to that. And I think as part of that, if someone does not want to be seeking treatment for obesity, again, across those three pillars of treatment, who am I to say to that person, you must, like every other healthcare provider, that you must have treatment at this time, right? I think the approach should be, or what are, when someone's coming into my clinical context, whether it's for mental health or obesity care, I think the first is to understand why they're coming in and what is their motivation, which often are things that are not related to any kind of lab finding or measurement, but about quality of life, or I want to be more mobile so I can spend more time with my young child, right? I want to be able to travel more with my family or loved ones, right? And those are the points to have those kinds of discussions and to think about a more holistic approach to kind of treatment, as opposed to me saying your BMI is 35 and you have this health condition. Here you need to get behavioral treatment and pharmacological treatment or surgery or whatever the intervention we're talking about. And this is the path going forward, because that is not going to resonate, and we know that is not aligned with where the individual sees kind of the most impact in their life. And sometimes people, just by asking, we like surface that together and come up with a more collaborative kind of patient-centered approach and plan.
It comes back to that all-important question you teach medical students, what matters to you?
Yeah,
That's what you have to ask the patient.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I don't know if I saw any hands raised. Well, I see one here in front. And we're going to watch you guys on the end. You're going to have to wave two arms so we don't forget you. And I'll ask the mic people to watch the two ends as well.
Hi. You mentioned childhood obesity. Do we have any idea about the rates of uptake and intervention and potential outcomes for children right now?
Yeah, so I think, again, the question, just I'll repeat it if people can hear, is about childhood obesity, the rates of intervention and uptake. I think there are, if you're talking about treatment interventions, I think there are, a need for further research in that. I won't scoop our own pediatric guidelines from Obesity Canada that are going to be coming out shortly, but I will just say a precursor to that is that there are definitely gaps in what we know and the literature and the research. There are some things that we can provide, but a lot of it is team-based behavioral, psychological interventions, family-based interventions as well. And then you're going to ask me how many people actually receive that, and I will just say I won't scoop our what we have our report card for Obesity Canada, which are a group of people here who are working on it. But that's for adults, but I suspect it's going to be even worse for children and youth, just because we don't have the system where we have team-based models that actually provide that interdisciplinary, holistic approach to care. And so my answer is going to be very, very low. It's going to be my professional answer to the uptake of interventions. It doesn't, but I think that's a starting point for us to have those discussions, to think about what are the models of care, where do we need to address those research gaps, what do we need to advocate for, starting with partnerships in school-based interventions and healthcare and that continuum that can help to bridge some of those gaps as well. Yeah.
And Ravi, maybe you could also address that pediatric aspect. I don't know how many stories I've seen in recent years about, 8-year-olds are now having diabetes because of obesity. Is this a growing problem? Is it a perception?
It definitely is, but I think in terms of the timeline, because it was not that long ago, it was actually the early 90s, where cases of diabetes in children that did not seem to be type 1 diabetes were being described, and there was controversy. People were debating, is this, maybe it is type 1 diabetes, but it's, some of the features are different than what we might expect. Whereas now, nobody would question that. It is absolutely clear that you can have type 2 diabetes in children. And so I think we've moved forward in that regard, and now we're in the era of earlier treatment. It's interesting because there are generally it's more difficult, some of the more intensive interventions that you do in adults, to apply them to children. But what you're seeing now is a shift towards more intensive treatment in children, and this is a recognition of the fact that our thinking has evolved, and there's no doubt about the ability for children the possibility of children having these conditions. And when you take it a step further, kind of the life course perspective, the benefit of treating children is actually greater ultimately than in adults in terms of the life course implications of your intervention. And so I think we're moving forward.
Another one in the middle. I don't know. How are you guys doing down there? No hand movement? Okay. Okay. Now we'll do this question, then we'll go to a virtual question.
Okay. Hi. First of all, thank you very much for such an insightful session today. Bettina Hamlin with Innovative Medicines Canada. I'm learning a lot today, and I'm learning a lot about the interconnectivity between, weight, obesity, insulin, mental health, pharmacy, pharmacokinetics, nutrition, etc. Could you tell us a little bit more where we are in Canada with these interdisciplinary team-based approaches where we can actually meet patients where they are and funnel them to the appropriate pathway for them?
Yeah. I'll take, maybe I'll start that, Ravi, and,
Sure.
and you can comment. I will say, again, I'll just do another plug for a report card, which will actually, from Obesity Canada, which will come out this year, which will share where every province is kind of standing in certain areas and highlight actually effective models that are going forward. But I'll just say, I think I can speak to Ontario, for example, because I practice in Ontario. We do have some areas where we have probably two components of this, where we have providers who are passionate about obesity care, who have formed interprofessional models using, I would say, innovative design techniques, technology, funding models to really build up, having an interprofessional team with a dietitian, physician, nurse practitioner, behavioral specialist, whatever that may be. It doesn't have to be a psychiatrist, and other kind of support staff, pharmacists and support staff. The challenge in starting like that is that, our healthcare system is not funded in that way, as many of us know, to really have this covered for the people who need it, right? It's not so different than mental health care, where team-based care is needed, and it's hard to find a comprehensive team. So there are people, and I know there's people in this room who could probably talk about this, who've built those programs from the ground up to think about how to create these models. There are provincial models out there as well, and so in Ontario we have the Ontario Bariatric Network. There are comparable models in some of the other provinces as well, where there are centralized referral pathways that have focused largely on surgical care and behavioral interventions, but are expanding into kind of medical kind of interventions as well, and there are some limitations. So I think, and it's it's interesting, in Ontario that came forward in an effort to save millions of dollars of sending people outside of the country for these interventions, and was part of the diabetes strategy, actually, Ravi, to your point, in the province of Ontario. So even then, people are thinking about prevention and early intervention of obesity in terms of treatment of obesity would be helpful with many other preventative measures for chronic diseases. So we have some of these, but we have huge variability, including long wait times in some of these publicly funded programs, and poor access for those who don't have the means to actually access some of these exceptional programs out there in the community.
Now, I would just add, not to be too diabetes-centric, but I think some of the lessons from diabetes are going to be applied to overweight and obesity care. And by that I mean that there is no diabetologist who would debate with you the importance of the team approach to the care of diabetes, because typically you will need, in addition to the physician, a diabetes nurse educator, a dietitian, potentially a social work, potentially pharmacy, and that is understood in many diabetes centers. I'm fortunate to work at Mount Sinai, where we have all of these different allied health professionals contributing to diabetes care. You also have, in the setting of diabetes now, the development of multi-complication clinics, where an individual might see not only their endocrinologist, but also their cardiologist and their nephrologist in the same clinic, because it's all part and parcel, and someone with diabetes may well need to also be seeing a nephrologist and a cardiologist. And I think that many of these things that have been happening in the diabetes sphere for some time are going to also be seen in the overweight obesity realm as well.
And a good reminder that we have some challenges dealing with complex patients in Canada because of often the way we pay physicians and other healthcare providers. So let's take one last question from online.
So this virtual question we have is, for how long should someone take the GLP-1? I asked because my family doctor told me that after 1 year I should come off the medication, but at the same information indicating I should take it for life. Are both options the same?
Ravi?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. And the truth is, it's one of the big questions right now in both diabetes and overweight obesity care. I'm going to focus particularly on overweight obesity because in diabetes, of course, you want to continue treating the diabetes. But the issue becomes you have these wonderful medications that can reduce important complications like your risk of developing heart disease, potentially mortality, as well as diabetes and other conditions. But when you stop, there typically does tend to be weight regain. So what does that mean? We have these wonderful therapies, we can prevent these complications, do we continue them indefinitely or not? And actually, one of my colleagues is planning a trial asking this type of question. How might we look at the long-term approach to the management of these medications? Because right now, we really don't know. It's kind of, in a way, a good problem to have. The medication is so effective and it does these wonderful things, and the fact that the question is, do we stay on it, indefinitely? Well, that's a good thing because it's better than if the medication didn't do all these wonderful things.
And just as important, will it be funded forever?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you have patients, they stop their insulin and they're very excited. That's a great milestone. Maybe they'd be excited stopping their GLP-1s.
Yeah, I guess you could anticipate that that scenario. Your question threw me for a sec because we do see exactly the situation that Andre has mentioned a lot of the GLP-1 agonist in certain patients will allow them to come off their insulin, not everybody, but in some cases, and patients are very happy about that. And now Andre's taking it the next level, getting them off the GLP-1 agonist.
Well, we'll end on that open-ended question. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking Dr. Sanjeev Sokalangam and Dr. Ravi Ratnakaran. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And you guys can step down. I'm going to stay here. We're going to go straight into our next event. We're actually going to step outside Canada for a little bit. And we're going to look at a country that's recognized for its excellence in obesity prevention in particular, and that's Finland. And we have a guest joining us from, I guess it's quite late at night there in Finland, but joining us, thank you for coming. We have Mariana Latki-Koski. She's the Secretary General of the Finnish Heart Association, and she's joining us virtually, as I mentioned. And first of all, I want to really thank you for being there, taking the time to be with us, join our event. I want to get right into questions, if I could. Obesity has been one of your many areas of research for many years. You're well known in this field. Could you tell us a little bit about the situation in Finland? We don't know a lot about it in Canada. Are your rates better than other countries? And then we'll talk into the why and why you're so good at prevention. We're just going to get the sound fixed here. One moment. This whole virtual stuff we've only been doing for 5 years straight. Eventually we'll get it right. Okay, want to try again?
Okay, good.
Yes, thank you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Okay, I was saying that thank you for inviting me to this event. And as you said, it's quite late. I kind of woke up about 17 hours ago, so it's quite late in Finland. But anyway, you asked about the situation in Finland, and unfortunately, I have to say that our figures related to obesity prevalence is not that good. When we're talking about adults in Finland, about 30% of females are obese, body mass index more than 30, and the figures or the prevalence for males is 27%, so it's quite high. It's far too high. And when we talk about our children, children with overweight, the prevalence of overweight among children from age 2 to 16 is about 26% for boys and 17% for girls. So from my point of view, the rates are far too high.
So your rates are a little bit better than Canada, but similar. Can you tell us a little bit about the strategies that have been used? I've read about one, Finland on the Move, for example. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, the Finland on Move is quite new one. We were lucky to have in our we have a parliament elections a couple of years ago, and when I say we, I mean we NGOs. I come from Finnish Heart Association, but we have a strong alliance with other NCD NGOs, including diabetes, cancer, and so on. So we lobbied hard to get national health and welfare program in our governmental program. And actually we were lucky to have two of them, and one of them is focusing on promoting physical activity, and that's called Finland on Move. That includes about 16 different actions, and of course, they are related to obesity prevention. They cover the whole lifespan from very little toddlers, actually very small children, when they attend maternity clinic and attend child baby clinics. They have a box with different equipments, and there will be, for example, a ball in that box to promote mobility and to promote physical activity in families with small children. But I think the most important and most interesting one in this program is we have so-called moving daycare, moving schools programs in which we try to integrate physical activity in everyday lives in daycare centers and in schools. So we are not talking only about physical education classes, but how to integrate physical activities, for example, when teachers teach, let's say, mathematics and other school topics, and also these programs focus on traveling to schools, how to walk and how to promote cycling to schools instead of driving, that parents take a car and take them to school. So
Yes,
that's
when I've
all kind of activities.
When I visited Helsinki, I've noticed that the schools, the children are very active. We're a bit surprised that you are investing in programs. You seem to have already be a very active society. Do we have a wrong impression of you in Canada that you're not already all healthy?
Well, if you visit Helsinki, which is the capital city, there's the infrastructure is different. But I think during recently the progress has been so that those children living in countryside they are more obese than children in cities, and that's one reason for that is that. There are no more little schools in countryside, so they have to travel to schools and sit in buses for several hours in a week. So the natural physical activities in those children living in countryside has been decreasing. So there's big differences between different areas in Finland, and also there are big socio-economic differences in rates of overweight and obesity, both in children and in adults.
Yeah, so a very similar situation to Canada, where we have worse outcomes in rural areas than urban areas, and we have very big geography. I wonder, talking about policies, could you also talk about Finland is known for its health for all approach to policy making? Could you talk about the impact of that on obesity, that every decision is supposed to be made through a health lens?
Yeah, that's a good aim, but how does it work in real life is a total different question. That's our aim, and we as health professionals we really like to have this see this happen. But I have to say that yet we work in silos, so it's. These programs, for example, this Finland and Move, it's a good example that they try to integrate physical activity and that kind of issues in the field of other ministries. For example, when we are talking about our environment, Ministry of Environment, and we're talking about our nature, how can we have access to our forests and keep our parks and so on, urban planning and so on. So it's very important to integrate the health issues and aspects to those decisions as well. And especially when we're talking about not at the national level, but at the level of municipalities, there the health in all policies should be that way of thinking should be more. Now I lost the word.
More integrated, perhaps, yes.
More integrated, yes, because when we're talking about health promotion and obesity prevention, those activities are not made in healthcare, but they are made in totally other fields. So we're talking about urban planning and we're talking about school meals. That's one thing we are very proud of. But at the moment in Finland, the economical situation is not that good. So and municipalities struggle with lack of resources, and we try to keep the quality of school meals at high level, because when there is lack of money, lack of resources, it's a risk that they get to the investments to school meals could be smaller than before. So it's really important to keep the level high.
Yes, you do have an excellent school meal program in Finland. It's one that in Canada we're just beginning to invest in, so we're learning from you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your organization as well, the Finnish Heart Association. What are you doing to address the obesity issue?
Yeah, well, Finnish Heart Association is one of the biggest NGOs in Finland. And as I said, we collaborate very closely with other NGOs in Finland as well. And we are not only the patient organization, but also a public health organization. And our mission is really to prevent cardiovascular diseases. And of course, preventing obesity is important part of our work. Myself, I do a lot of advocacy and lobbying to promote healthier environment for Finnish people. And of course, we have also all kind of projects and activities that are related to obesity prevention. And one of our, I would say, it's just our star product is called Smart Family. We really want to focus on well-being of children and families with children. And during the past 15 years, we have developed a so-called Smart Family program, which is a program that provides tools and materials and tips for everyday life, both for families with children, but also, and I think more importantly, for all those professionals that work with children, with families with children, not only in healthcare, but also in, for example, in daycare centers. So that program covers all kind of topics related to everyday life, and the aim is to adapt healthy lifestyle from the very beginning. Actually, this program is meant to start at maternity clinic, where clinics where the child is not born yet. So we believe that promoting healthy lifestyle from the very beginning is very, very useful, and this program covers all topics from nutrition, physical activity, sleep, rest, mental health. Screen time is a new thing. You can imagine why, because there's too much screen time we spend with mobile phones and so on, not only children, but we are adults as well. And one important issue which is integrated in Smart Family is how we talk about weight, and that's related to weight stigma as well, because it's important to important to realize when it's time to talk about weight and when it's not. And when we talk about when we discuss things with children, we shouldn't talk about weight at all. We should talk about healthy food and physical activity and sleep, not the weight.
Yes, we've discussed the issue of stigma a lot today. I wonder, have you also addressed, I know in Finland there's a lot put on the issue of alcohol consumption and excess alcohol. Does that come into the discussion of obesity?
Yes, that's a hot topic at the moment. Thank you for asking. That's one of our top issues in our advocacy and lobbying at the moment, because the availability of alcohol is well, then the current government is kind of they have a aim of making the availability of alcohol more available and even more cheaper, and of course we don't want Finns to drink any more alcohol at the moment, and it's related to obesity, of course. So that's something we really need to fight for. That I don't know if you know that we in Finland we have a monopoly. Strong alcohol drinks are sold only in special stores, and the initiative has been made that that monopoly should be stopped, so that alcohol could be more available everywhere in every grocery stores, but that's not something we don't want to happen.
Again, a very similar policy discussion in Canada we're having, so there's a lot of parallels. The final question I wanted to ask you was about drugs, about GLP-1 agonists are getting a lot of attention, especially in North America. I wonder if in Finland this is an issue, these drugs are being paid for by the state, or are they being used more commonly now?
Yeah, it's a current issue. I'm not a specialist in obesity care, but of course, and treatment. But of course, that's an issue. Is very it's on media, and there has been quite a lot of discussions about the availability of that drug, because as far as I know, the availability of that drug has not been quite good. So that's one part of that discussion.
And I wondered if, just in closing, you could give our delegates, our audience, some advice on how to address prevention. You've talked a lot about starting young, addressing the whole family. Is that the way to go? Is that the way we're going to tackle this issue in the long term?
Yeah, I think that's way to go, and it's of course we have to do something for weight stigma. That's one big issue as well, and I think the obesity is quite difficult topic to talk about, and I think that's. Well, how to put it? The question often is that who is to blame, whose fault is this, why we are in this situation. That's the wrong question. We have to find the solutions and find those who take responsibilities, and it's responsibility of society to build that kind of environment where it's easy to choose healthy food and easy access to physical activities and so on. So we need to stop blaming parents for childhood obesity. We need to support them every way we can. That's my message, I think.
Great. Well, Dr. Mariana Latti-Koski, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us tonight, for giving us some information about Finland. I want to see kiitos. Thank you and good night.
Good night. Hyvää yötä.
So we're going to move, I'm just going to get stuck to this chair. I'm not setting a good example for movement, but I'll do that after. We're going to move right into our final speaker, our keynote speaker, if you will, Dr. Arya Sharma. He's going to join me up on stage soon. He's an emeritus professor of medicine and past chair of obesity research at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. He's also the founder and past scientific director of Obesity Canada, past president of the Canadian Association of Bariatric Physicians and Surgeons, one of the world's leading authorities on obesity science, having co-authored more than 500 articles on the issue. And I have many more pages that I'm not going to read because I want to hear from you, not about you. So Dr. Sharma, thank you for joining us today.
Well, it's good to be here.
So I want to jump in, as I've done with the other panelists, put you on the spot with a really big question to start off with. What's the proper way to measure obesity, to know if someone has obesity? Is it BMI, waist to hip ratio, waist circumference, just eyeballing it? What's the best way to do this?
Okay. Well, we could discuss this forever, but basically, if you think about body mass index, it's a number you calculate based on height and weight. So it's basically a measurement of size. I mean, there's the same amount of information. If you told me your clothing size, I mean, I would have the same information. It doesn't measure health. It doesn't measure whether you're sick or not. And the line I like to use is, BMI tells me how big you are. It doesn't tell me how sick you are. As a medical doctor, I don't care how big you are. I care how sick you are. And so we're either trying to prevent you from getting sick, or we're trying to, provide treatments that are going to make it better. Now, all the other, the problem why we use body mass index is because it has to do with the traditional view of obesity as being more of a risk factor. So when you look at things as risk factors, you do population studies, so you've got the epidemiologists out there. And obviously, body mass index is easy to measure, so it's easy for epidemiologists to use it. And of course, if the body mass index in Canada goes up, that means people in Canada are getting bigger. And because we know that there is an association between size and the amount of body fat you may have, statistically, your chances of being sick or being unhealthy goes up. But when you bring this down to clinical practice, when you're seeing patients one by one in your clinical practice, BMI doesn't really tell you much. I mean, I could have someone with a BMI of 35 who's got fatty liver disease, they've got diabetes, they've got sleep apnea, they've got reflux disease, they're unhappy about how their appearance, all kinds of problems. And then you got the next guy who's got the same BMI, pretty healthy, blood pressure is normal, glucose is normal, everything is normal. So why would you treat them the same? Which is part of why we and others have said that that we should not be relying on body mass index to make a clinical diagnosis. I've got to see the patient, I've got to do the lab exams, I've got to talk to the patient, I've got to listen try to find what are the problems, what are the health problems that we're dealing with, and then you make a decision whether or not those health problems warrant medical treatment.
But we've been hearing these stats all day, 30% of Canadians are obese. That's all based on BMI. Does that mean those numbers are meaningless?
No, I don't think it's mean. I mean, it tells us we have a problem. I think BMI actually underestimates the problem of obesity. See, if you define obesity as the presence of excess body fat that affects health, you will actually find that there's people at much lower BMIs than we would normally think of, who actually have health problems, where if they went out and they lost, 5 pounds, 10 pounds, those problems would get a lot better. So I think the problem with using BMI cutoffs is not that we overestimate the prevalence of obesity. We're actually underestimating it, and we're underestimating it quite dramatically. So when today's World Obesity Day, we talk about, there's more than 1 billion people. I would say there's more than 1.5 billion. There's probably almost 2 billion people with obesity if you actually apply the definition of obesity, and that is, say, people living with body fat that is detrimental to their health. If you use that definition, there's a lot more people than 1 billion.
But you've been talking about this forever. I'm sure I talked to you about this 20, 25 years ago. We talked about this.
That's going down in the history of medicine. But people still think that this is a topic we need to talk about. I mean, we've been talking about obesity as a chronic disease for at least 20 years, and people are still, have difficulty wrapping their head around this whole notion, when the concept is actually pretty simple. And that is, like every other chronic disease, the problem with obesity is once you get it, and it pretty much doesn't matter why you get it. There's lots of reasons why people might actually, get obesity. But once you have it, it kind of becomes a lifelong problem. Now, that does not mean that you need medical treatment or you need surgery. I mean, I've met lots of people who've been able to lose weight and keep the weight off with diet and exercise, but that's treatment. The day they stop their diet and exercise, that weight's coming back. So, I always have been doing this for 30 years. I've not cured a single case of obesity. And then people say, well, that's not good. But then I have to admit, well, I've also not cured people with type 1 diabetes. I've also not cured anybody, with coronary artery disease. That's basically the definition of a chronic disease. A chronic disease is a disease which once you have, you're kind of stuck with and are going to have to live with for a long time, which doesn't mean we can't treat it. We can treat it, we can manage it, sometimes better depending on the resources we have. And obesity is pretty much like that. And I can tell you that, I've met a lot of people who've struggled with obesity for most of their lives, and despite successful treatment, it's a little bit of like what Ravi said about people with diabetes, right? We don't talk about curing diabetes, we talk about people going to remission. And when someone with obesity, for example, has had bariatric surgery and now their BMI is 25 and they're feeling great because all the health problems they had with this, with obesity are gone, I would still not consider that person as cured. That person is in remission and still has to, stick with the treatment. If you went into this person and reversed the surgery for whatever reason, that weight would come right back.
And you don't cure them, but you make their lives better.
Oh, absolutely. And we do that in medicine all over the place. There's a lot of conditions for which we have no cures, but we do manage these conditions, and that's the whole science of medicine, right? That you make the diagnosis, you have the treatment, you try to match the treatment to the problem you're trying to solve. And in obesity, unfortunately, for a long time, we have not had very good treatments, right? We've had pretty ineffective treatments. I always say, telling someone with obesity to eat less and move more is about as effective as telling someone with depression, you just need to cheer up. We've tried talk therapy. We used to do a lot of talk therapy for mental health. Well, that didn't go well. We're still doing a lot of talk therapy for obesity, which does have its place in some people and can be highly effective, but it's not that everybody who has a couple of extra pounds now needs to go and see a psychologist. I think that's not the issue. It has been a long ride getting to the point where we are now, that for the first time we have what I would consider to have not only highly effective medications, but medications that are safe, and we have a lot of clinical data now supporting that when we treat people with these medications, we're not just reducing their body weight or reducing their body fat, but we are actually getting very significant improvements in health, and that's ultimately what it's all about.
And I'm going to come back to the issue of the drugs in a moment and their impact. But I want to stay with the definitions for a bit, because the Lancet Commission just tackled this question. A very interesting long publication saying essentially we need to distinguish between clinical obesity and preclinical obesity. Essentially, they tried to give a definition. How did they succeed?
Well, in a sense, the concept is right. I mean, we talk of pre-disease conditions for other conditions. Like we have pre-diabetes and then we have diabetes. We have pre-hypertension and then you have hypertension. Now here, the concept is we have pre-obesity and then we have obesity.
And we have life and pre-death.
Well, yeah, everybody. I don't know how useful it is because. I think there's a lot of tiptoeing around this whole issue, around this idea that if you rely on body mass index and we are over-diagnosing this, we are medicalizing the problem, and we are kind of labeling people who may not be labeled. Now, I personally do not have a lot of, which might be true. Like, if you've got Olympic wrestlers coming to your clinic with lots of BMIs of 30 and you label them as having obesity, that's clearly a mistake. I don't have a lot of Olympic wrestlers coming to my clinic, right? Most people coming to my clinic with BMIs of 35, 40, 50, 60 are there because they have significant health problems, which we know will get significantly better if we can get effective obesity treatments to them.
But the biggest people aren't always the sickest people.
Oh, no, absolutely not, which is why we came up with something called the Edmonton Obesity Staging System. This was years ago, where we
2009, I think?
2009, we first published that, right? So where the concept is very simple. It's not about BMI, it's about what are the medical problems that a patient actually has. Those medical problems, they can be, they can affect mental health, they can affect physical functioning, they can affect medical problems, talking fatty liver, diabetes, etc. And it's when you see those problems, which are probably there because of the weight gain, and we know are probably going to get better when the patient actually gets effective obesity treatment, that's how you make clinical decisions, right? So it's not about, like I said, it's not about how big my patient is. It ultimately comes down to how sick is my patient, and whether or not we have evidence that treating obesity in people with that condition actually reduces their risk, improves their quality of life, etc.
And is all fat created equal, or is there good fat and bad fat?
See, and that's the real problem. So let's go back to the body mass index. The reason that we use body mass index is again, when you do population, if I would take everybody's body mass index in this room, and I plot it on a table, and then I put everybody into a DEXA machine and we measure the amount of body fat they have, I'll get a nice correlation that the people at the one end of the spectrum, those with the higher BMIs, are probably going to have more body fat than the people at the lower end of the spectrum. And that works great when I'm doing population studies. And that's why we've used body mass index, because when you do population studies, there's a pretty decent correlation, statistical correlation, between BMI and the amount of body fat. Now, even if I assume that this was a perfect measure of body fat, which it's not, it still doesn't tell me much about the kind of body fat. It doesn't tell me anything about the kind of body fat. It doesn't tell me where the fat is located. It doesn't tell me whether this fat is causing medical problems or not. And that's where the whole fat issue gets complicated. See, fat is an essential organ. The whole reason why we have body fat is because body fat stores calories. Right, so I can eat more than I need today, and those extra calories, they go off into my fat tissue, and then they stay there till I need them, and that could be, decades from now, and that's actually a pretty safe place to keep it. That pretty much only applies to the kind of fat that you have underneath your skin, right? So the skin fat, subcutaneous fat is the technical term. That's probably the good fat. Now you may not like it for aesthetic reasons or whatever, but actually that's good fat to have. In fact, we know that people who don't have that fat actually get into all kinds of problems. All right, so that's the good fat. But then we have fat in other locations where some of that fat is okay, but when that gets to be too much, we start having problems. One of those compartments in which you want some fat but not too much fat is inside your abdomen. So we talk about visceral fat. And that's where this whole idea of measuring waist circumference comes from. So I put this, this measuring tape. And we know that having too much visceral fat is directly related to people having metabolic problems. So when we talk about diabetes, fatty liver disease, and a whole bunch of other things that may happen, that's very often related to visceral fat, which BMI does not measure. Then there's fat around your heart, there's fat around your kidney, those are all fat depots. The real problem is when you start having fat in organs where you're not supposed to have fat at all. And the liver is one example, and we've got skeletal muscle, and we've got the pancreas, and we've got other organs. And when you start putting fat in those organs where you're not supposed to have any fat, then the real problems start. And we call that ectopic fat. So you can think of fat as being in three compartments. We've got the skin fat, we've got the fat inside your abdomen and around your organs, that's still fat. And then you've got all this fat that's in organs where it's not supposed to be. All of this, is what we worry about when we talk about obesity, and none of that is being measured when I measure someone's BMI. And so that's the problem with the definition. That's why I need to have more than just a BMI to make the diagnosis.
So let's talk about how we get rid of this fat. There's diet, there's bariatric surgery, there's drugs.
All right.
Are those all still relevant?
Okay, so let's get down to the real problem. The real problem, when we talk about caloric balance and we say, this is all about calories in, calories out, and if there's more calories in than going out, then those calories have to go somewhere, so they go to your fat, and that's basically the whole story. The corollary to that is that if I can reduce the amount of energy intake or increase the amount of energy that I spend, I can change that balance between in and out, and I can pretty much be whatever weight I want to be. And that works great if you're dealing with physics. The problem is we're not dealing with physics, we're dealing with physiology. And the problem with physiology is that, physiology is really biology messing with physics. So if this was pure physics, you'd be right. This is all about calories in and calories out. But we're not dealing with physics. We're dealing with physiology. And the problem with the physiology is that we have a very complex physiology that is actually there for one thing, and that is to protect us from losing weight. Because losing weight is never a good thing. Right? All through evolution, losing weight has always been a sign that there's either not enough food, or there's been a huge amount of physical activity that I'm going to have to do, or there's an illness, or there's some problem. And the reason we are here is because we have this physiology that actually prevents us from losing weight. Now, since 50 years, we've got the obesity problem. And now when I go in and actually try to lose weight by eating less and moving more, this physiology that is actually there to protect me from losing weight kicks in. And it turns out to be highly effective. And so it basically sabotages all my efforts. So I start by eating less. Well, what's the natural response to eating less is I get hungry. So I get hungry, and the more of that I do, the more cravings I get. Now there's certain diets I can play around with, keto diets and intermittent fasting and play around. But at some point, my body realizes there's not enough calories coming in. So what does it do? It increases my appetite, it increases my hunger. My thoughts start revolving more and more around finding food. Foods that I would normally not eat suddenly become highly attractive. I always use the example here of, I haven't eaten all day, I come home hungry. And it turns out that in that situation, a cold pizza is the most delicious food you can find.
Or a Kit Kat.
Or a Kit Kat, right? So even stuff that you would normally not consider eating, in that state of hunger, that state of caloric deprivation, that suddenly becomes the most attractive food. At the same time, the other part of the physiology is that if there's not enough energy coming in, your body is going to make sure that there's less energy going out. And that is kind of devious, because it's not something that you really notice. Some patients will complain. They'll say, I'm kind of feeling cold. Their cold sensitivity goes up. So even in summer, you'll find they're wearing a sweater because they're cold. And that's their body basically reducing the amount of calories it burns. And the body's very effective in doing that. And in fact, when you go on any diet and you start reducing your caloric intake, on the one hand, you've got your hunger and appetite going up. On the other hand, you've got the amount of calories you need going down, which is basically your body trying to protect you from the weight loss. And it does so pretty effectively, which is why nobody on no diet ever disappears. And I have to always tell my patients who had bariatric surgery that, don't worry, you're not going to disappear. Because at some point, that physiology is going to make sure that you hit this plateau, right? So enough is enough, and then your body kind of protects you from further weight loss. And actually, very often, getting past that point is very, very difficult. So the typical thing for anybody trying to lose weight, any diet, doesn't matter. First week is great. You lose some weight. Most of that is water. Next week, you don't lose quite as much weight, but it's still working. And then as you get progress into your third week, fourth week, fifth week, that becomes harder and harder. It slows down. And at some point, you're still doing everything that you were doing before, which means you're still sticking to your diet, you're still doing your exercise, you're doing everything you're supposed to do, but you're no longer losing weight. And so you've hit this plateau, which is basically your body saying enough is enough. And because of that physiology that your body is using to protect you from weight loss, unfortunately, that exact same physiology also sets you up for weight regain. So the minute I come off my diet, or the minute I say, for the marathon runners in the room, the minute you start running those marathons, that weight's going to come back. And you can see this in almost every condition. It doesn't matter how you lose the weight. It doesn't matter what diet. It doesn't matter whether this is fast or slow. It doesn't matter whether you do this with exercise or no exercise. It doesn't matter whether you're doing this with psychological counseling or not. It doesn't matter whether you've done it with a medication or not, or a gastric balloon, or you've had a gastric banding. At any time, if you stop the treatment, reverse the treatment, patients go right back to where they started, because that's how bodies work.
So let's jump to this, I'll say new treatment to get around the physiology.
All right.
GLP-1 agonists.
Sure.
Start by telling us, if you can, in real simple lay terms, how they work.
All right. So you guys can all relate to this. Every time you've had a meal, imagine yourself, you're hungry, you haven't eaten all day, there's a buffet, you go there, you start eating. At some point, you feel full. Most of us will feel full. Why do you feel full? A lot of people think, well, this is because your stomach stretches or maybe your glucose levels go up. No, it's actually because your gut releases a bunch of hormones, which we call incretins, which essentially tell your brain that you've just had a large meal. They have very specific action. They go to a very specific part of the brain, which is called the hypothalamus, which is where the energy balance gets regulated. So your brain kind of gets a message from the gut about the fact that you've eaten, the amount you've eaten. In fact, even the composition of the diet is signaled there. And then your brain responds to that, and when they say, okay, now that's enough, you get a sense of fullness, of satiety. That's called satiety, right? That is a hormonal signal that comes from your gut. And one of the hormones that gets released from your gut after a meal is GLP-1. And we've known this for a long time. And even the fact that when you inject this GLP-1 into people, that it suppresses appetite, has also been known for a long time. But for reasons that we may or may not want to get into, this was never really developed as a way. Nobody had that aha moment where they said, well, you know what, that might actually be a good treatment for obesity. And we get, it's an interesting story why they didn't. What we're doing now with this GLP-1, what we've realized now is that, see the normal GLP-1 that gets released from the gut, the biological action is very short. So, I eat my meal, my gut releases GLP-1, GLP-1 goes to my brain, tells my brain I've eaten, brain says, okay, that's enough, and I'm full and I stop eating. But then the GLP-1, it doesn't stick around forever, it kind of disappears. And then I get hungry again, and then I have another meal. Now that we know that GLP-1 does this, what the pharmaceutical industry has done is they've taken basically this GLP-1 molecule, which is a bunch of amino acids. It's like a small protein. It's a protein hormone. And they've modified the molecule so that it doesn't break down and hangs around for much longer than it normally would. And so when you look at people who've actually taken this as an injection, it's the same hormone. You just inject it. It gets into your blood. It gets into your brain. It goes to your hypothalamus and makes your hypothalamus think you've just had a large meal. Okay. Now I've just had a large meal, I'm full. So now I'm in front of a buffet, it's got all my favorite food, and I look at the food and I say, I wish I could eat this stuff, but I'm actually not hungry. In fact, even if I try to eat this stuff, maybe I'll nibble on this and I'll nibble on that, but there's no way that I'm going to be gorging myself on this buffet as I normally would if I was hungry and if I wasn't full, right? So you have to think, so if you want to understand how this medication works, you just have to picture yourself as just having had a large meal. And after you've had the large meal, I draw back the curtain and there's this buffet with your favorite foods. I say, now be my guest, eat as much as you want. And you'll find that you're actually eating a lot less. Why? Because your brain thinks you're full. And because my brain thinks I've just had a large meal, I'm going to eat less. And because I'm eating less, I start losing weight. Now, normally if I lose weight, the physiology should kick in and say, hey, you're losing weight, you need to eat more. But because I'm injecting the stuff, my brain still thinks I'm having a large meal when in fact I'm not. And so the struggles that you would normally have if you ate less, the struggles we've talked about, I'm thinking of food all the time, I'm hungry, I want to eat. That suddenly goes away, right? And this can get to the point that some patients will tell you, what, doctor, for the first time in my life, I haven't actually, there's actually been hours where I haven't thought of food at all. In fact, there have been days where I haven't thought of food at all, and to them, this is a completely new experience. This would not happen if your brain thought you were starving, right? So what we've actually done here is that because we've understood how the physiology works and how the body works, and how these signals that come from your gut tell the brain that you've just had a large meal, now that we've understood the physiology, we say, okay, fine, that we can do, because we can make the hormone and you inject the hormone and then the brain thinks you're full. And that has made it so much easier for patients actually to lose weight without cravings, without hunger, without all these stuff. Now, there's one downside to this. A lot of people have trouble understanding this is medications only work when you take them. And the problem with that, of course, is that you take the medication, your brain thinks you are having these large meals, which you aren't. You're effectively losing weight. Brain's happy, you're happy, and then I take away the medication. Now guess what happens? It's like the brain suddenly wakes up and says, hey, where did all my fat go? And now it goes into sort of overdrive and tries to get that weight back, right? So I've lost my 40 pounds. The brain did not notice because it thought the 40 pounds were still there, and now I've taken away the medication. Your brain wakes up and says, hey, what happened to my 40 pounds? And now I want my 40 pounds back. And your brain will do what it can to get the 40 pounds back, and then the weight's back, and then patients say, well, this stuff didn't work. Well, it didn't work because you didn't take it. I'm not aware of medications that work when you don't take them. So that is the downside. And a lot of people find this very disappointing. Say, yeah, Dr. Sharma, so this means you're going to have to stay on it. I said, yeah, but what's the problem? People for diabetes, they take insulin, they stay on insulin. People with thyroid disease take thyroid hormone, they stay on their thyroid hormone. People who've got other conditions take other hormones and they stay on those hormones forever. So what exactly is the problem here? Well, yeah, because I don't believe that we should be treating people with obesity with medication, because I still think that if they actually did the work, they would still be able to somehow. I say, listen, you haven't listened to a single thing I've said, if that's what you still believe.
So we're going to have to take these drugs forever, and that's not a bad thing.
Well, you take, so here's my standard response. This is a question you get all the time. So your patient, so doctor, sounds great. How long do I need to take this stuff? I say, you probably need to take this stuff till you decide you want to put the weight back on. Okay? Or something better comes along, right? Because to be honest, now that we've actually understood that this is probably the way you go, why don't we just harness the body's own biology to treat this condition, like we do for so many other conditions? We are just starting. GLP-1 is the first, effective principle that's come out of this research, but there's a whole bunch coming, right? So we're still at the start of this, and it's turning out that there's going to be a whole bunch of these different hormones, and they're going to be in different combinations, and they're all going to probably work, and we're going to have to find out. But now that we've understood the principle, the pharmaceutical industry is very clever. They can synthesize all kinds of molecules and all kinds of combinations. We're going to have to do the studies to see, do they work? Are they tolerated? What are the side effects? What are the long-time problems that you may or may not get? But that's what we do for every disease, right? When you get new medications, you do the research and you figure out how they work.
But to your long line of questions, you have to add, is it affordable?
See, affordable is I get this question a lot, and this takes me back again in the history of medicine. So I'm old enough now that I remember the days when statins were introduced to medicine. Now, statins, as you know, is the cholesterol-lowering medication, right? Before statins, people with high cholesterol who were dying of heart disease, we had no real treatments. I mean, there was a lot of this diet and exercise stuff going on. I remember the lipid clinic back then. There was a whole army of dietitians, and we had this American Heart Association Step 1 diet, Step 2 diet, and this was about not eating your eggs and skipping the butter and all that stuff. Didn't work, not very effective. And then the statins came along, and you had a dramatic reduction in cholesterol. You started having all these studies showing that not only do you lower cholesterol, you actually prevent strokes and heart attacks. But it was expensive. I mean, when statins first came on the market, there was people calculating, well, there's no way we can afford to treat everybody's high cholesterol with a statin. That's never going to happen.
Yeah,
that would completely blow
us.
the budget. Today, everybody's on a statin. Why? Because they're dirt cheap. Why are they dirt cheap? Because they've been around forever. There's been a lot of competition in the market. And that's what generally happens. When new medications come out, they're expensive. Then the next company comes out, they bring in, so you get competition, then they go generic. And that's exactly what's going to happen over here. I mean, if you remember the first GLP-1 that came out for obesity, that was liraglutide. The one we have now, which is semaglutide, you inject once a week. That one you had to inject daily. That's already gone off patent in a whole bunch of countries. There's a whole bunch of countries where you now get generic liraglutide. That's going to happen to all the other medications we have. So I think, so when people tell you, well, we can't afford to possibly treat everybody because these medications are way too expensive, I say, yeah, that's at today's prices. Those prices are not going to stay, right? We just heard about, my colleague from Finland telling you that part of it is availability. Well, that's no longer going to be a problem because all these companies that totally underestimated the amount of the stuff that they were going to need have geared up their manufacturing capacities to such that within a couple of years there's not going to be a shortage of any of these medications, right? So these are things that you work out, right? So I think price is not going to be the problem, supply is not going to be the problem. The problem that we are still going to have is the bias and discrimination. A lot of people say, this is just Dr. Sharma and the pharmaceutical industry trying to medicalize obesity. They just want to put everybody on drugs. Obesity is not a real disease. We're overdiagnosing it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all bias and discrimination, right? Drugs are not going to solve that problem. And so I think everything that we talked about earlier over here, the bias and discrimination, the assumptions that people make, the stereotypic people proclaiming that something that is obviously a chronic disease is not a disease, is just, to me, that's just bias and discrimination, right? See, the Germans have a very interesting definition for disease, which I find interesting. And they say disease is a condition for which you should probably go see your doctor. It's very broad, but it kind of says this, if this is a problem, and and we can bring this down to obesity, but if you think your weight is a problem for which you should probably go to see your doctor, it's a disease. If it's not, and you don't think you need to see a doctor, well, then maybe you're okay, right? It's a broad discussion, but it's a very common sense definition, right? Because it doesn't, I remember when hypertension was not a disease. Hypertension used to be a risk factor. Type 2 diabetes was not a disease. It used to be a risk factor. Cholesterol was not a disease. Cholesterol used to be a risk factor. And I could say it's the same for obesity. Obesity was not a disease. It used to be a risk factor. Today, it's a disease. Why? Because we have a much better understanding of what it is. And ultimately, what you have is an increasing body of evidence that actually shows us that when you treat people with obesity for obesity, you reduce the problems that they have, right? I mean, their sleep apnea gets better, their pain gets better, their mobility gets better, their quality of life gets better, their depression gets better, their risk for heart disease gets better, their risk for stroke gets better, their heart failure gets better, their fatty liver gets better. I mean, I could go on forever. We have evidence showing all of this, that these are all results of treating obesity, right? So, sure, if you have none of those problems, then you don't have obesity, and then you don't need treatment. But if you have any of those problems, for which we now have evidence that treating your obesity is actually going to take care of those problems, not treating obesity, in my viewpoint, is discriminatory. And frankly, I mean, your only excuse is, well, it's too expensive. Okay, but that excuse is not going to be there forever.
So we're almost out of time, so let's close the loop by coming back to something Sandra said that struck me. She put up these quotes from doctors, you know, essentially blaming her,
All right.
etc. Let's finish with this. You know, the landscape has changed dramatically with these drugs arriving. Even with bariatric surgery, it's underused. Do doctors know how to treat obesity, and how can we teach that
Okay,
so that
all
we
right.
can address the problem?
See, even to this day, you can get a medical license to practice medicine in Canada. After completing all of medical school, you've completed all your postgraduate training, and nowhere in any of this have you ever treated a single patient for their obesity. And they'll still happily hand you a license to practice medicine. You would never get a license to practice medicine if you've never treated diabetes or you've never treated hypertension, right? You've treated a lot of people with obesity, but you've never actually treated anybody for their obesity. And we're still licensing people to practice medicine who have never done that, right? That needs to change, because the entire generation of people, of doctors that you have, health professionals that you have practicing medicine today, never learned how to treat obesity. They never learned to think of obesity as medicine. Most of them don't understand the basic physiology of stuff that we've talked about. I mean, a lot of you will be leaving this talk if you paid attention with more knowledge about obesity than your average medical doctor would actually have, right? And that's a huge problem. And so it's organizations like Obesity Canada, and it's most of what I do now is try to, bring doctors up to speed, getting them to understand the basic physiology that they should have learned back in medical school. It was never taught to them. Most of them have never treated obesity, but that's okay. You can learn how to do it. And in defense of the doctors, I must say that I have never, and I've been in the medical field now for almost 40 years. I have never witnessed the kind of excitement and enthusiasm amongst the health professionals on embracing a new treatment as we have now, right? I mean, when I give talks on obesity to medical doctors, the room is packed. We've got, you can remind me how many Canadian doctors have now taken the American Board of Obesity Medicine exam. Every year the numbers are going up, right? I remember the first obesity conference that I went to, it was probably the size of this room with the number of people now. Now you go to an obesity medical meeting, there's 4,000 people, 5,000 people. Doctors recognize that this is a problem they need to learn about. They're educating themselves. Thankfully, there's a lot of resources now online that you can actually, including the stuff that Health Canada's, Obesity Canada is putting out. And so I think it's just a matter of time before doctors actually start embracing this treatment, because once you've done it, there's no way back. I mean, once you've seen the benefits of these treatments in your own patients, their blood pressure getting better, their diabetes getting better, their pain getting better, their depression getting better, all these problems just getting better. Once you've seen that in a couple of patients, there's no way you're going to go back to practicing medicine without treating obesity. That's not going to happen.
Well, the bell tolled for us to tell us time was up. I was going to ask you to end on a hopeful note, but you've already done that, so thank you. So please join me in thanking Dr. Arya Sharma. And I'd now like to, with my remaining voice, invite to the stage Vincent Lamana. He's the president of Novo Nordisk Canada for some brief closing remarks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Vince Lamanna, and it's a privilege serving as the president of Novo Nordisk Canada. As a global healthcare company, Novo Nordisk has been dedicated to driving change and defeating serious chronic disease since our founding in 1923. Our mission is built upon a rich heritage of 100 years in diabetes and now 25 years in obesity. We strive to pioneer scientific treatment breakthroughs, expand access to our medicines, support broader education and understanding, and work hard to prevent and ultimately cure the diseases we treat. It was an absolute honor for us to sponsor today's event on World Obesity Day, and I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the speakers for their thoughtful discussion and their insightful insights. Let's give them another round of applause. And it's definitely clear from all the sessions today that we've come a long way, but we have so much more to do. C'est un honneur pour Novo Nordisk de sponsorer l'événement d'aujourd'hui à l'occasion de la Journée mondiale de l'obésité. Je voudrais exprimer ma gratitude aux intervenants pour leurs discussions réfléchies et leurs précieuses contributions. And a special thanks goes out to the Globe and Mail for hosting today's event, and I'm particularly grateful to Mr. Andre Picard for his excellent moderation today and for his ongoing efforts to advance critical conversations at the public policy level. Let's give him a round of applause. And as we heard from our esteemed panels, the world is facing a growing epidemic of chronic disease, with obesity being the single biggest risk factor. In Canada, more than 2 in 3 Canadians are either living with overweight or obesity, and our country has one of the highest rates of obesity amongst OECD countries. This alarming rate and rise continues, with Statistics Canada recently reporting a 4% increase in obesity since 2015. Obesity is not just about excess weight. It's a chronic condition linked to over 200 health complications, including hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, certain cancers, and decreased life expectancy. However, the situation presents opportunities for joint prevention, better detection, and more efficient disease management, ultimately improving outcomes for individuals, health systems, and communities. Despite significant advances in medical treatments for obesity and diabetes, we cannot rely solely on treatment alone to overcome this epidemic. We need a paradigm shift towards integrated chronic disease prevention and care. Thank you. And to address the rising prevalence of type 2 diabetes and obesity, Novo Nordisk is taking proactive measures to prevent these diseases before they start. But collaboration at all levels is essential to create sustainable and healthier societies with better patient outcomes. But no single company, country, or institution alone can tackle this. Our best chances lie in a solid multi-sector, public-private partnerships rooted in evidence-based, targeted, and innovative approaches to obesity prevention and care. And we're really proud that since 2021, Novo Nordisk has invested and catalyzed close to $60 million in provincial, academic, and community investments for chronic disease prevention initiatives in Canada. However, we must and can and will continue to do more. And as we conclude today's event, I encourage you all to join this collective effort to advance the prevention and management of chronic diseases. Let us advocate for the recognition of obesity as a chronic disease, to improve patient outcomes, to enhance health system resilience, and most importantly, to achieve the economic benefits and for society that we deserve. I thank you again for taking the time to join us today and for your attention to this dedicated and very important cause. Thank you.
And finally, thank you to Novo Nordisk on behalf of the Globe and Mail for your sponsorship. Thank you to the audience that's here live and online. And finally, please join us for a little networking reception, a little nosh before you leave and hit the road, and safe home. Thank you.